welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from the Drexel University Picture Gallery. Today our guest is science fiction writer, blogger, and journalist Cory Doctorow. Cory Doctorow is a strong advocate of information sharing, and his novels Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, Little Brother, Makers, and Others, as well as his collection of short stories, Overclocked, can be downloaded free on the internet. Cory Doctorow, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thanks, Paula. I'm glad to be here.
Good. Well, let's start by talking about science fiction. This is a genre that you write in and you write about. And I wonder if you tell us about how you got started. I imagine that you read a lot of science fiction as a boy, and I wonder how this interest developed and what were your favorite writers who inspired you?
Well, I mean, I think everybody, when they're kids, has some exposure to science fiction, especially in film and so on. There's a lot of it. My dad had been a kind of science fiction reader, although not like a really intense one by the time I knew him. You know, by the time I was old enough, he was reading political stuff. But there were a lot of science fiction novels around the house. And there were science fiction fans at school and so on. And for me, I think one of the turning points is when I was about 9, we went down to, on a school trip to a reference library in Toronto, which was then called the Spaced Out Library and is now called the Merrill Collection. It's a public library. It's the largest public reference collection of science fiction in the world. And it was founded by the feminist science fiction writer and editor and scholar Judith Merrill. And it was such, and is such an amazing institution that it was one of those places that really felt like a homecoming. And then a kind of, another great thing about living in Toronto was there was an old science fiction bookstore, the oldest in the world, called Baca, that was staffed by science fiction writers. And it's kind of, you know, maybe there's some restaurants that are known for having a lot of actors who would be great working at them. Baca was a store staffed by writers who would be great working at them. So I went in as a kid, and Tanya Huff, who's now a very successful science fiction writer, sold me a used copy of H.B. Piper's Little Fuzzy. And
the rest is history.
The rest is history, yeah.
Okay. Well, science fiction is interesting as a genre. It's very much its own corner of the publishing industry, and sometimes maligned, I will say, by those in the industry. I mean, do you have any thoughts about that, the way science fiction is sort of set apart from mainstream literary fiction? Do you wish it were different? Do you have any thoughts as to why that's the case?
Well, I think that, you know, there's science fiction, the genre, and science fiction, the marketing category. And science fiction, the marketing category, is a very good reason to exist. If you walk into a shop and you want to find a book that is pleasing to you, then it's nice for there to be a section that's in which someone has assembled a bunch of books where if you like this kind of book, you'll probably also like that kind of book. It kind of prefigures Amazon's whole recommendation system, and it's the basis of figuring out how to sell books to people. I was a bookseller for a long time, and I'm glad to have it. I'm glad for there to be an easy way for people who are likely to like my book to find it. Science fiction as a genre has some very fuzzy boundaries, and some people don't like it and some people do. And there is, I think, as you say, in the very literary mainstream, a certain amount of ill feeling for it. Most of the time I tell people, I'm a science fiction writer, or I'm reading a science fiction book on the bus or on a plane, and someone goes, hey, I read science fiction too, and we have a lovely conversation. No one's ever said a bad thing to me about it. In my whole existence, it was once when I was thinking about going to York University. I went to the Independent Studies program, and they would put together a program with other departments, and the guy who was kind of doing the intake picked up the phone and called the creative writing department and said, I have a young man here who says he wants to write science fiction. And the guy said so loudly I could hear it through the phone, he said, we only teach literature here. But in my entire life, this is the only time I've ever faced
so
any
maybe it's apocryphal. Maybe it doesn't really
exist.
Or outdated.
I think it's outdated.
Okay.
It's out of date.
But you have written somewhere that science fiction, the best science fiction, is allegorical. And you've said that it uses the device of futurism to show us the present, which I think is a very provocative statement. Could you explain? I do want to talk about that idea with respect to your own books soon, but in a general sense.
Sure. Well, okay, so first of all, I don't think that anyone can really write about the future. I think that you always end up writing about your present, whether or not you intend to. So some writers are doing deliberate allegory, and some of them you just go back and you look at what they were anxious about, you know, Go back to 30 years and there's all these books like Harry Harrison's Make Room, that was turned into the film Soylent Green, that are all about population pressure, right? He's not so much predicting the future as he is predicting the present. He's taking the kind of Malthusian panic that was already around in the zeitgeist and turning it into a novel. And then there are some writers who really do deliberate allegory. I don't know about you, I don't think Mary Shelley was worried that we were going to start hooking up corpses to lightning rods and have them terrorize Europe. I assume that she was worried about the way that technology had gotten out of the control of its makers and the way that we had conflicting emotional relationships with it and all of those things. And so I really do think that science fiction is either intentionally or unintentionally allegorical. And I think the way that science fiction stories work is you have this big story that's like a big gear, and that's the world, and you have a little story that's the person. And the two of them, one's a microcosm for the other. And there's a lot of torque on the person's story because it's got to turn that big gear. And they turn together. And I think that oftentimes when science fiction doesn't work, it's because the personal story isn't a good analogous microcosm for the world story. And I think that one of the big differences between films and books is science fiction films tend not to have that component. The personal story is just your basic film action story, and the world is just something that's kind of an interesting piece of technological speculation or aesthetically very interesting to look at, but otherwise completely unconnected to that personal story.
Well, you feel movies can work where books can't if the two don't mesh?
Yeah, so for example, I mean, look at a movie like The Fifth Element, right, which, Bruce Willis, Milla Jovovich, visually absolutely stunning. As far as I can tell, this is a story about Bruce Willis driving a taxi around a bunch of sets, right? And mostly what it is it's a tour around a bunch of sets. He's de Tocqueville touring, Hyper America, but there's not a narrative that's threaded through it, or if there is, it's as thin as paper. And most science fiction movies, I think, work like that. They're just kind of they're either a straight up action adventure story, or they're not even that. They're just a road trip story.
So you feel that's because the visual element is obviously so strong in film that it's able to image forth the future in a way that's compelling enough that you don't need character?
Well, I think that they have characters. I just don't think they have stories.
Okay.
Or they don't have stories that are allegorical or that are microcosmic for the world. I think they're just your basic kind of like if it were rock and roll, it'd be a 1-4-5 progression. It's your basic beat Hollywood movie story with a world in the back that's contrafactual in some futuristic way. But it's there's an exception to this, which is Terry Gilliam's Brazil, which is both a visually stunning work of science fiction and a story in which the world and the person are microcosmic and macrocosmic, and the person turns the world. So it's not necessary to it, but it's maybe a tick of science fiction filmmaking.
Well, that's interesting. I'll keep that in mind the next time I see a science fiction movie or read a book. You grew up as in a very politically involved family in Ontario.
In Toronto, yeah.
Toronto. And your family, your parents were Trotskyists. Are still. I guess you don't outgrow that necessarily. And you yourself, from an early age, were involved in various movements in Greenpeace and nuclear disarmament and so forth. So your activism goes way back, and you still are, and we're going to talk about this with respect to your novels, still are very much involved with political ideas. Do you think of yourself as an activist first and a writer second? How do those two senses of self cohere?
I guess if the job of the science fiction writer is to figure out how society is changing technology and how technology is changing society, and the job of the activist is to use technology to change society and steer the way technology is changing society, then those two jobs are really closely related. And I have to say I don't draw an enormous distinction between them.
Okay. Well, let's talk about your novels then.
Okay.
I thought we'd start by talking about your 2008 book, Little Brother, which was, I guess it's a young adult book.
That's
initially,
right, yeah.
Although I suppose it's a very hard category to limit. It could also be an adult book.
I think it comes back to marketing again. And I also think that the primary difference between young adult and adult fiction, well, one of the main differences between it is that there's nothing in a young adult book that's inappropriate for a young adult. That isn't to say that there's any reason that an adult can't read it. It just means that there's certain constraints around the form. But some of my favorite books are young adult novels. Daniel Pinkwater, I think, is like the greatest living American writer. He writes exclusively
Yes.
in adult novels. So.
I like Daniel Pinkwater too. Anyway, this book, Little Brother, is an interesting subject. It deals with a future terrorist attack in San Francisco, where I assume you were living at the time, or had been living.
I had lived there, yeah.
And the limits on the freedom of individuals that results on the part of the government to protect people after this attack. And I assume that this was influenced by the Patriot Act?
Sure. Well, and the whole response, really, I mean, I live in the UK now, where we've got our own version of the Patriot Act squared and cubed. You know, the mechanism of terrorism is to evoke an autoimmune response, right? It's not to blow up buildings. It's to make the police go crazy when you blow up a building. It's to make people go crazy when they blow up a building. It's to take away people's freedom. It's to convince people to take away their own freedom because you blew up a building. That's the main effect of terrorism. It's not that one box cutter equals one building taken down. It's one box cutter equals one building taken down equals one nation that turns its back on all of its values, right? That's why terrorism is so effective. We live in the golden age of terrorism, right? There's never been a better time to be a terrorist, because there's never been a better time in which terrorist victims were more willing to help them do their dirty work. Because today we live in a society where all you need to do is raise the specter of terrorism and you can justify any measure that degrades our quality of life.
Okay.
You know, no one ever blew up a plane with a shoe. There's no reason to believe that some dumb jihadi who thought that he could blow up a plane with a shoe was correct. If it did work, we would never know that planes could be blown up by shoes, because they just randomly fall out of the sky. And yet we all take our shoes off, right? Because once there's a threat, then you need to, you know, there's no cost too high to pay. So, you know, I think that the war on terror is really a great parable about how technology, specifically communications technology, is used to convince people to destroy their own lives.
Your latest novel, Makers, is also very topical, and it deals with the world in the midst of a financial crisis that I think you've said was modeled initially or inspired by the dot-com crisis, but that of course is very timely now in light of our situation. Tell us about the premise of this book, Makers.
So yeah, as you say, it was inspired by the dot-com crash. I just got lucky, and the world's economy melted down between the completion of the book and the publication date. It's a book in which the economy has collapsed, and there are all these big Rust Belt companies that are sitting on cash reserves, but no one wants to buy their stuff, and their money is just dwindling away, and Silicon venture capitalists go and very boldly snap up a couple of them, Duracell and Kodak, merge them together, call them Codacell, liquidate all their assets, and give the money to tiny little entrepreneurial startups in dead malls across America, $10,000, $20,000 increments, like the microfinance that's all across Bangladesh and so on. And little garage inventors hack together new stuff that they go into production for 6 weeks, and then it's been cloned and there's no more profit in it. They invent something else, and they take $10,000, they turn it into $20,000. It's 100% return on investment in 6 weeks, but they can only do it with small sums of money. And it creates a new bubble. And everyone in America does this. They call it the new work. 20% of the American workforce relocates to do this. And then, like all bubbles, it crashes. And all of a sudden there's no more money in the system, and yet people still keep making stuff, because it turns out they actually didn't need all that much money to make stuff. They're sitting on dead malls that no one can figure out who owns them, and they're inventing out of commodity hardware that is just kind of lying around on scrap heaps, and they've got the internet that they can use to share tips with each other, so what do they need any of the rest of this stuff for? And it's a kind of melancholy book, but also I think a hopeful one. And in that second phase, they get, because they've kind of left the system, the system doesn't have a lot of patience with them, and they end up embroiled in a lot of lawsuits that lead to violence, that leads to all kinds of stuff.
Fascinating premise about the ingenuity of the American, that entrepreneurial and creative spirit, really.
It's a real Yankee workshop kind of story,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you also have your first novel, I find very provocative, Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom. Takes place in a Disney theme park. And your latest book, Makers, also has a Disney motif. So I guess I want you to address, first of all, the theme park as an interesting